Hello, everybody. I'm Judge Rosemary Collins from Winnebago County, Illinois. Winnebago County is about 90 miles north and west of the Chicago area.
And good morning or good afternoon for the East Coast folks. I'm Judge Susan Carbon, and I'm calling in from Manchester, New Hampshire. I am a family court judge here. I've been on the bench for about 25 years and have had the privilege of serving previously as president of the National Council and done a lot of work with the Family Violence Department over the years, and as well had an opportunity to work at OVW for a few years. So I'm very excited that we have so many people on to talk about coordinated community responses and domestic violence today.
Thanks, Sue. This is an issue near and dear to my heart, and I'm the presiding judge of the Domestic Violence Division in Winnebago County. We're one of 6 mentor courts in the country, and we've had a long history with coordinated community councils, and we're hoping that by the end of this webinar you'll be able to better figure out and describe what your role, what your court's role will be in engaging the community to work on domestic violence. We hope that you'll be able to take the techniques and the other ideas from other jurisdictions that you can put in your jurisdiction to improve and strengthen your community's response to domestic violence. And we also want to assess the role of judges in providing leadership in the the coordinated community response. So those are our goals for this, and like Sue said, we're really excited that you're joining us today.
So let's get into the meat of this. Let's talk first for a moment about exactly, and make sure that we ground everybody in this, what a coordinated community response is. The goal behind a coordinated community response, or we call it a CCR for short, is to ensure that all of the institutions and the organizations, so the justice system, the human service folks, advocacy responses, and so forth, all together work together so that ideally the incidence of domestic violence can be reduced. The theory behind this is that if everybody is working together, ideally these gaps will be bridged and nobody falls through these proverbial cracks that we have. We really want to seal up a system and make sure that it can be seamless from institution and organization down the line to the next institution and organization. We have to ask ourselves the fundamental question, and that is, why is it that court engagement with the community is important? I think all of us who've been doing domestic violence work know that domestic violence is far more than just a legal issue. In my view, I think it's perhaps the most intransigent social and legal issue of our time. It's something that law enforcement can't solve all by themselves, nor can advocates, nor can courts. It takes all of us working together, and so when we look at answer number 2 here, I sort of picked that one out first. We need all of us working together with a multidisciplinary approach, all the different entities that work around domestic violence. When all of us are working together, we are able to work better because the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, and then we can coordinate our responses. We need to know what each other one does. And in my view, I think courts are well suited to this task. We all know that when judges convene a meeting, and especially if we serve food, people come, and that's when they talk, and that's when they engage, and that gets us to the interagency communication. For me, once we get people to the table and they start talking and they start developing relationships, that's when we can see the possibility of change happening. It's not an overnight process, but it's something that we build upon over time. So there are really several objectives to having a good, solid, coordinated response to how we approach domestic violence in our communities. And there are several goals. But fundamentally, a CCR is intended to be victim-centered. So the goals are that we want to enhance the efficacy of services and reduce any redundancy in the resources that we have or that were being used because they're limited. And we should be using them as wisely and appropriately as we possibly can. We also want to stress that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. The services should be tailored to the specific needs of the victim. Ultimately, we want to be able to hold the offender accountable for his behavior or her behavior if that's the case, because it's that side of the coin, holding the offender accountable, that is ultimately going to end the violence. We can't hold the victim accountable for ending the violence. That's the offender's responsibility, and we can never lose sight of that responsibility there. So this is a little bit more challenging when we're on a webinar and we have people spread all around the country rather than having all of you in person like we might at an annual conference. But we'd like to know what your experiences are. So we've got up on a slide here a couple of different polling questions, and we'd like for you, if you would, to type in your responses so that we can get a sense from you as to, number one, whether you have a CCR in your community. Kind of a broad question first. Secondly, whether the CCR is judicially led. So are you or your peers in your community, or if we have clerks calling in, or your judges leading the CCR? And then are you yourself involved in a CCR? So we're going to be looking at the responses that you chat in for us. So chat away so we can kind of get a sense of who's out there and what you all are doing. Okay, we've got...
See a lot of responses coming in.
Yep, this is good. Whoa, they're going fast. Okay, Judge Shit, we've got yes, 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 that's great. Have a CCR, not judicially led, CCR. And this is interesting. Nebraska has a statewide domestic violence and sexual assault response, but not judicially led, but judges are involved. That's great. So I see other folks typing in, but I unfortunately don't know where people are from. Some communities do. It looks like there's a lot of sense that several jurisdictions do, but not a great sense that they are being judicially led. And we're going to get to some discussion about that shortly. So how about if we move on, and we will pick up. Okay, here we go. We've got the polling is in. Well, it looks like we're still populating here. So it looks like a majority have got a CCR in their community, and a majority are judicially led, or they are involved, and 3/4 are not judicially led, and in fact probably more than that, because we don't see anybody where it's judicially led. A number are unsure, or they don't have them in their community. So looks like we've got a large number of judges involved, but not in the leadership role. So that's still excellent work. Okay. So let's move on into our next topic here. And this is, in particular, the question we want to look at now is, if you are wondering why it is that we need to have a community-centered approach to domestic violence, I'd like for everybody who is on the call here to think for a moment about the prevalence of the crime. 1 in 4 women are abused by a partner in their lifetime. So if you think for a minute about the number of women statistically in your family, or statistically the number of women you have working at your courthouse, and you take 25% of those women, that's the number, statistically, who will be abused in their lifetime. That's a significant number of people. Domestic violence is also very much a gendered crime. 85% of domestic violence incidents involve men abusing women. That's, again, very gendered crime. And then finally, a reminder that 32%, a third of all women killed in the United States, die at the hands of a male intimate partner. So this is a significant, serious crime that, despite all of our work, and we're making great progress, still remains a serious crime.
And that's really why it's important that the community be involved in a plan to end domestic violence because it's not an issue that can be handled just by the courts. It's not an issue that can be handled just by advocates or just by police. It really needs everybody at the table to do a community-centered approach to domestic violence to really start to break the chains of this public health epidemic in our country. And we know that because there's so many issues that occur in a domestic violence relationship. When you work with victims and offenders, you know that there are physical and logistical challenges to these relationships and to them accessing services and to them even knowing about services. We know how many times victims are so very isolated that they can't get the support they need and they don't even know really where to go. And what I think is interesting too is we found out with our CCR is that sometimes we don't know where the support is either. So many times by having the CCR, it's just a good way for all of us in the community to check in and find out availability of services because it's important that we can provide for the safety of our victims and the children. You know, there are 15.5 million children in the United States per year that are exposed to domestic violence, and we really need to make sure that those children are safe. There's huge economic pressures on domestic violence victims, and that's one of the a significant reason that many victims are unable to get the safety they need because they're economically bound to the abuser and have no source of other income. So all these issues, the cultural issues, the economic issues, the safety issues, the isolation, all of these add up to really an overwhelming hurdle for a lot of victims to overcome. And that's why if we as a community get together, we can help break those things down. And we also know how important it is for for all of us in the field to have the specialized training to deal with domestic violence cases. They're not like my armed robbery cases. They're not like the other cases. These people will continue to have contact with each other often because of children or because of economic concerns or family relationships. So it's important that the people working in domestic violence understand these specialized issues that domestic violence face and then can help our victims deal with them. The other issue about this is that we know that many of our marginalized and vulnerable populations are at greater risk of isolation. We've seen an increase in this area alone that because of the concern by people in the community about ICE and their immigration status or the immigration status of their loved ones, that we are getting less people accessing orders of protection. We know that people will not access the court system if they feel it could lead to risk for their family and friends or themselves. And so it's important that we make sure we come up with new strategies to reach out to these populations, and you can only do that in a community-centered approach. We also know how difficult it can be for the LGBTQ population because they are often isolated from the community by their partners. Many of them are still not disclosing to the community at large what their status is, and they're afraid of discrimination by the courts, by their employers, by other people in the community, law enforcement. And we know that's true, and we know how hard it is for this community and how important it is for them when you consider that the vast majority of the related homicides in the LGBTQ community were people of color and under the age of 40. So there's two populations there that are sometimes under-accessed and under-served by the court system. So some of the key principles I want to tie back to a really important statement that Rosemary just made, and that is that there are, for some populations, collateral consequences to seeking relief from the court, depending upon what a court or community approach to the problem of domestic violence may be.
So our goal with CCR is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, which is to provide help for victims who need it. So the coordination itself may take a number of different forms, but what we really want at the core of this is the commitment of everybody to work together to do these three fundamental principles. And the first one there is to have a shared philosophical framework of what we're going to do around DV, and that we all understand it, that we understand, secondly, each other's roles and their responsibilities, but then as well to develop a plan for how we're going to improve the response of all the different groups that work with victims and offenders in DV. So it's not enough to understand the roles and the responsibilities of one another, although that alone is huge. And I can't understate that. I can't overstate that. It's really critical that people understand who does what and why, and what happens kind of in what sequence. But the group, more importantly, needs to be committed to improving their part of the process, and that they take ownership of their part. And sometimes as a judge, it's a little hard to hear when somebody says, you know, you really should have done this, or do you realize how you left somebody feeling? To be willing to listen, to be open to self-examination and critique, to look at what's going on in your clerk's office, look at what's happening in your own courtroom, and then assess it and evaluate it, invite critique, and then go on to work together to improve how we're delivering services, and understanding that this process of development, evaluation, development, and so forth is ongoing. It's not a static one-off process. We should be committed every day to trying to do this work better than we did it the day before. And it's really making a commitment to the community to do that.
That's right, and I know in our CCR we have what we call the Vegas rule. What we say in CCR stays in CCR, so that people can talk about issues that they might feel uncomfortable talking about in another place. Particularly, we don't want people to feel like they can't bring up an issue because they don't want to criticize the clerks or the judge or other things like that. So, and we found this out. We found this to be a good rule because of the history of our CCR. And the history of CCRs throughout the country, I think, is an interesting thing to look at, because we know that we started looking at the issue of domestic violence differently in the 80s, and it really came out that a different model was needed. And the Duluth Domestic Violence Intervention Project piloted the CCR project about that time. They were the first one to do that. We started about 20 years ago with our CCR, and many of the CCR programs are based on that model today. Because the model really does what we've been talking about, is trying to bring everybody together and continuing looking the list of who that everybody is to make sure that we're inclusive of new partners in the community, new areas that we hadn't thought about, but bringing everybody together who is at all related to the issue of domestic violence. So we bring our batterers programs together. We try to provide alternatives to just a simple jail sentence. I know everybody knows the old joke about it. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we know that works for us too. If all we have is a jail, then it looks like a pretty good place to put everybody. But we know that's not the best place for everybody. We know that that doesn't work for families, and that actually can increase problems with victims for their safety, because they are often reluctant to access the system if they think we're just going to send somebody to jail. So we have to develop programs that will, number one, of course, provide for victim safety, but also meet the needs of the victim with respect to their family issues, and also help the offender change their behavior. The initial success of the first CCR resulted in the Minnesota legislature mandating that intervention projects be modeled after that Duluth model, and that followed. After that followed the blueprint for safety, which if you haven't had a chance to look at, I would strongly urge you to take a look at. It gives you really a blueprint for safety, which is a nice thing to have and a good thing to look at with respect to your community and what you're involved with and what you're doing. and how maybe those practices could be tweaked a bit. The Attorney General then finally in '84 recommended CCRs to domestic violence reformers and the operation of the justice system. So then the Bureau of Justice funded 11 family violence demonstration programs to establish the interagency coordinating committees, because it's really important that we work together not only on a local level but on a national level, on a state level, on every level with people involved in this working together. And then, of course, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984 also supported grants for DV prevention programs, shelters, training and technical assistance in many other states. So that really helped lead the movement to push CCRs in the forefront of communities and help them see that as a model for positive change and positive work in their communities with this issue. The coordinated community response has been developed, expanded, and perfected over the last few decades. I know ours has changed substantially over the 2 decades that we've been working with it. And we have brought in partners that we hadn't had there originally. And we have a strong group of sexual assault providers that are coordinating with us now. We have the religious community that is more and more involved that we didn't have originally. So I think it's important to know that you must evolve as a coordinating council because you must remain relevant in everyone's lives and everyone who needs to access the court system. So you have to make sure you include all the different groups and reach out to parole groups, reach out to elder abuse groups. So every one of the meetings can be broken down in specific interest areas if there's a big need in that community, but also you can deal with them as part of the entire coordinated community response. So it's an exciting thing, really, when you get these community response teams up and going. It's really exciting to bring people together who really care about this issue, who meet together regularly, who discuss innovative practices, and work to really work on a coordinated response in the community to this problem.
So we're going to open this back up to the group and have you give us some input once again. We'd like to know what specific kinds of practices are used by your communities across the country in domestic violence cases. So if you would chat away in the box, and we're going to be looking to try to assess what types of victim services might be available in your community and what kinds of services do they provide, actually, and then look at the services that might be available for offenders in your community. And then finally, if you have a dedicated domestic violence court, what does that look like? Who are the stakeholders who participate in that to contribute to a better outcome for victims? So Rosemary and I are going to be watching to see what you all type in for the kinds of victim services or other practices that are used in your communities in domestic violence cases.
And I did see one question, Sue, that from, I think it was Lee. Now I can't find it.
Okay.
I think it was Lee.
How do you get religious community involved?
Right. Yeah, for some reason I've lost that. But I can answer it because we had a lot of difficulty with that at first. We had a lot of difficulty bringing in members of the religious community, not only because they were a little resistant to the idea of working in a collaborative way, I think, at the beginning, but also there was a lot of turnover. We had a lot of turnover with some of our religious leaders in the community, but we just kept working at it, and we try to present programs at the churches. We try to get members of the church who are interested in this work to reach out to their leaders. We go personally to the different religious leaders and talk to them. We often have, an educational session where we invite them to find out about this issue. So it's an area that you have to really work hard at in terms of getting these religious leaders involved. But once they are involved, we've had a lot of spin-offs, and they have gone on their own to really work in the domestic violence area. And one of our local, we have a rescue mission here that is religiously based. And they've really embraced the issue and have gone on to do training for religious leaders in the nation. They've had people come in from all over and do programs. So it's a challenging thing. I also think that often if you can get a member of that congregation, whatever congregation it is, to approach them instead of just the court, that helps. So that you can go with somebody to meet with them and talk about it, because there's an inherent suspicion, I think, when you're reaching out to a group that hasn't been reached out to before, that somehow you might want to blame them or that it might be an uncomfortable place for them to be. So it does take a lot of groundwork, but the results are pretty spectacular when you can get them on board.
Mm-hmm. Just to pick up on that, a number of years ago in New Hampshire, we had a group, an interfaith group, a wide variety of faith leaders who really began to understand as a result of some work that we did at the state level. And they just took the issue and launched it themselves and became very active in just educating their own congregations about the problem and being more responsive to it instead of giving what had been sometimes advice for victims that we really did not think was wise or safe to do. And once they understood where we were coming from and we invited them in to participate, it just was the beginning of a very productive relationship. So it is something that it can be very challenging just depending upon who you're working with, but stick with it and continue on. I want to pick up on one more thing here. There's lots of great information. I hope people are reading what others are chatting in the box here. But somebody picked up on the fact that you've got a dedicated security officer. I think it's Alicia Hooper, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And I want to stress how important that is, that when you're in court, you have security officers who understand domestic violence and how the dynamics work, particularly when you're in a confined setting like a courtroom. I know the council is going to be doing some work on that, but it's a really important issue that I hope we'll have more conversation about another time. Are you seeing any other questions coming up, Rosemary, that we should?
No, I don't. It's hard, sometimes it's hard for me to follow this, but I'm seeing some really exciting things happening out there about dedicated domestic violence dockets, review teams with the shelter, and I think it's great. If you have a CCR, make sure you bring all those people together. And I think it's Terry Roman that said that how they have stakeholders and program partners meet regularly, and we have found that is a really important part of this. And it keeps people involved. It keeps them looking towards the future and not so much, everything's, falling apart, but it helps people move towards the future. So that's a really exciting thing to see about, too.
So let's move on while we're kind of on that topic and talk about a number of different examples of the CCR. And we've seen folks type in a number of different examples. And one of the core initial examples of a CCR was actually the Domestic Violence Coordinating Councils. And I think that they had their genesis in the early 1990s. At least I always attribute these to Judge Len Edwards out of Santa Clara County, California. He is now retired, although still very active. I don't think there's anything really that's a judicial retirement anymore, because he's very active, a former president of the council, and he pioneered the concept of bringing different representatives of the community together to have these regular kinds of consistent monthly or bi-monthly meetings that Rosemary's been talking about. These can happen either at the local level and within your community. In a small state like New Hampshire, we have both local and statewide commissions that sometimes address different issues, some more globally than others, and the local ones are more unique to the particular court that you might have. But all in all, they represent, and they're comprised of multidisciplinary groups of representatives from really every conceivable organization or entity that regularly works with victims and offenders. And it's these folks who really breathe life into the concept of a coordinating council. So the usual suspects will be courts, victim advocates, law enforcement, medical, mental health, schools, because we have lots of teens in particular, and then children impacted by violence, folks from different housing programs, local housing, child protection, elderly and adult services, battery intervention programs, and then one thing that came up that I'm seeing scrolling through in the chat box are not forgetting that there's also the criminal side to domestic violence, and having folks who are involved in the criminal cases also participate in the CCRs, because we may have started out with a focus on civil in these arenas, but very much involved with criminal as well. CCRs also have a really important community aspect. Part of that is educating not only the members so that they can learn and do a better job, but also they can be the front lines for educating your community about domestic violence that people who don't live with it may not understand or appreciate. So having a CCR regularly engage in public outreach to the community can be a very effective use of the council. And I want to give you just one example of the kind of a community outreach that, in my view, is really useful. In New Hampshire, we picked this idea up from something that Senator Biden did years ago before the Violence Against Women Act was passed. And for those of you who are old like me, you may remember way back in the early 90s, then Senator Biden created a document called A Week in the Life, or I think his was A Day in the Life of Victims Across America. And it was in response to this NIMBY syndrome that his colleagues in the Senate had, not in my backyard, where his colleagues could not believe that their constituents were being abused or sexually assaulted. They just could not believe that awful things were happening to women. So he got this idea of having a nationwide day in the life and put together this chronicled monograph of incidents all across the country on that particular day. And that was one of the most effective tools of many that they used in finally getting the original Violence Against Women Act passed. We've done that. We've replicated that a couple of times in New Hampshire, both on a statewide basis a number of years ago, using Valentine's Day as the day that we picked, and then last summer replicated the same concept here in our own court, in our own community in Manchester. And when we gathered all the information from law enforcement courts, child protection advocates, we put it together into a monograph and used it as an educational tool during October's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And that has had huge impact in our community. So these kinds of things can be a really functional, useful way of bringing the community together to gain a better understanding of what's happening under the noses.
That's a great idea, Sue. I think we'll probably pick that up. And I think that's really one of the most exciting things about bringing people together is you do get all these great ideas from other jurisdictions. And we found in our coordinating council that a big part of what we do in the meetings is we try to put some time aside for an educational program where we bring in new ideas or new videos or other concepts that we haven't heard about before that we're not doing in our area and that we want to bring to the attention of our community. And it was because of that that we found out about this lethality assessment program, the LAP program, developed by the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. And this is developed in in coordination with Johns Hopkins University and Jackie Campbell, a lead researcher there who's a lead researcher in the area of domestic violence. And she developed this 11-question lethality screening tool and an accompanying response and referral protocol or for police officers to use when they're out in the field. So we thought that sounded like a good idea, and so we are actually in the midst of implementing the LAP program in our community at this time. And it's a wonderful program, and we're really hoping that it will achieve its goal, which is to eliminate domestic violence homicides. And that's what this is really all about, is eliminating domestic violence homicides. And this questionnaire is given to the police departments. The police departments go to a victim's home when they get a call. They administer this questionnaire. It's easy. It's simple. It's something that the police can use and will use, and then it's an easy tool for the victims to use. The police are outfitted with phones, and then when they get the phone, or when they go there and they do this assessment, they will immediately connect the victims to a domestic violence service provider in the area. The service provider, who has been specially trained in lethality assessment also, then can reach out to this victim in a way that they hadn't been able to reach out before. So they really focus on these victims who have been identified as being at high risk of being seriously injured or killed by their intimate partners. So if the victim screens high danger and the screener makes a phone call, there's a 24-hour hotline where they reach out and they get guidance, and they hand the phone to the victim. And then the victim can talk to the victim services provider immediately. Our hotline workers are also trained to make sure that they know how to communicate with people in this crisis situation, and that they can try to engage them in services, because we know from our personal experience, and I think it's borne out nationally too, that if we can get victims connected to services, then we can really increase their safety. And so many times they just can't make that next step, so we want to bring the services to them, and that's what we do by handing them the phone and reaching out with an advocate right away. These advocates then, after the hotline worker turns it over to an advocate, the advocate will contact the victim immediately to reach out to them for program services. And they know, they're highly trained in safety, so they know how to reach out to a victim in a safe manner, because it can be a very unstable time in victims' lives after they've reported an incident to the police, and they have high risk for danger at that time. So we want to make sure that we safely interact with them, that they can get the program services, that the advocates will do follow-up visits or just call them and make sure they're okay. And so we found out about this program because of our CCR, and we decided to follow up with it. Our police officers are going through the training right now, and so we're very excited about moving on, and this is a great example, I think, of something concrete that can come out of your CCR that will fundamentally change the practices in your community as to how you handle domestic violence situations, both for the police, the courts, and the community.
I want to stress that the LAP is a well-studied, well-documented, evidence-based program that fundamentally reduces homicide in your community. So I really encourage folks to look into that and consider adopting that process in your community. Another type of CCR is quality review committees that, instead of being the preventive work, are the retrospective look at homicides in an effort to try to figure out what went wrong. So the worst possible thing in a domestic violence incident, obviously, is death. So we look at these cases and we examine where the victim had contact with the system, if any, and what might have been able to be done differently so that the outcome would be different. And by doing this, these fatality review committees can either be created by statute or executive order, and in New Hampshire ours is executive order, but it gives us an opportunity to either have immunity by statute or the different entities sign an MOU together so that we are confidentially reviewing records, which may include medical and other records, to try to understand what at each stage of the process could have been done differently. What can we learn? It's not a finger-pointing process. In fact, that's the key element that fatality review committees across the country stress. It's got to be folks coming in feeling like they can openly share information, and if they discover something that could have been done differently or better, that they implement that change. And they do it with an eye toward, we're in this together. Again, another part of that philosophical commitment. We're in this to do it together and to get it right. And if we've made a mistake or if we learned something better that maybe we never thought about before, we can hopefully change practices that will save lives down the road. Lots of jurisdictions will publish reports about their committee recommendations, and then periodically cycle back to see whether those recommendations have been implemented. And having that type of ongoing review can be really important.
I think fatality review committees are really great for the learning process, and I've had the opportunity to see some videos about some fatality reviews, and they're really an exciting way to look at it. We weren't able to do a fatality review in our community, but we set up a different kind of program, and it was a direct result of our CCR meeting. We have a lot of police involvement in our community response team, and they really wanted to do something different, and they said, we see the same 10 offenders every week. We send police out over and over and over again to the same households, and it's frustrating for the police. They want to be able to do something to help intervene in those cases. They also don't want to keep going to the same house over and over. And so we brought together all the members of our community coordinated response team and developed this program that we call Covert Divert. And the reason it's covert is because we're concerned about victim safety, but it's a domestic violence response team that deals with the top 10 offenders that the police department comes up with on a regular list. So they find out who they're having the most problems with in the community, and they bring this list to this meeting. Now, this meeting is not attended by any judges or any member of the judiciary at all. This is a totally separate part of our community response that is not communicated to the judges. And in this group are probation officers, advocates, parole, legal services, the state's attorneys, our legal advocacy clinic that we have here in the community. And so those people come together because we found that often before, if there was an incident in the community, that incident wouldn't be taken back to probation. So they did not know that their probationer was in fact going over to see somebody who had a protective order if a charge wasn't filed. And so this, even though the police may have been called, if the charges actually weren't filed, they didn't know about it. And so this is a way to coordinate with all the members of the community, and it's been particularly exciting to see parole involved because then they can reach out to these defendants right away and say, you know, we know there's some issues going on in the community. What's going on? Let's get you into more classes. Let's get you going to AA, you know, every night instead of once a week. So it's an attempt to try to break the chain of domestic violence before there's a homicide. And so it's been going on for several years, and the police really like it. I never go to these meetings because I'm not allowed to, but the groups of the community, they have formed new relationships with each other, which is a great side effect of these meetings, is the probation now and the police have a closer communication. And so probation gets calls from police officers saying, hey, I saw Johnny over on this street, and I'm concerned about that because I know Susie lives 2 blocks away. And so it's been a really interesting and exciting way to get these different parts of our community who all are concerned about the issue to talk to each other. And with the state's attorney's office there, it's a quick response. So if the police say, we've got a problem with this guy, instead of going through layers of paperwork to come to the attention of the particular prosecutor who may have that case, the state's attorney can go back and say, you know, we need to focus on this particular person. So it's been a really exciting and interesting way to handle it, and it came out of our meetings, and it was really driven by the police department.
That's terrific. I want to turn to a different kind of an example. Let's move away from homicide for a second. And another type of example of CCR is in the development of statewide protocols. In New Hampshire, we, and I think lots of states are in the same boat, we have protocols for everything because protocols drive practice. So all of us have got statutes and we've got court rules, but we also have protocols that really get down to the nitty-gritty of how each step, literally each step of the process works, and when do we need to intersect with whom to make sure that, for example, a protection order that gets issued here gets entered on time, gets served on time, and then is informed to the victim that all of this has happened. So all these multiple different agencies that need to be working together, we need the same script to be working off of. So I would urge you, if you have not yet developed protocols, consider doing that. Again, these have got to be done in a multidisciplinary fashion. In some jurisdictions, they're led by courts. Others, they're led by different agencies or organizations, but they always have got multidisciplinary participation. Some states use their STOP money to publish these. Others use just their judicial education budgets, but there are all kinds of different ways that you can fund the actual publication and creation of the protocols. So just to recap for a second about who the partners are in this process. We've touched upon this in lots of the different kinds of topics that we have here, but these are some of the most common stakeholders that we have in a CCR across the country. These are the obvious ones. What I want to point out here, and hope that maybe as you've looked at this, you're saying, oh, there's somebody who's not here. And that somebody, because I wanted you to think about that, is the defense bar. As a judge, it is really important that we have members of the defense, your public defenders, your defense attorneys, and others who represent other interests besides just victim interests. Although at times victims can be the defendants in cases, so it's helpful from that standpoint as well. But these need to be broad-based organizations for judges to be able to participate in. And I'll get to that in a moment and later, but it's really important from an appearance of propriety standpoint that we are a member or members of community groups like this that are promoting community safety, not just victim safety.
That's great. A really important part and of this whole of the procedural justice, which is the whole fundamental underpinning of our system. So if people don't believe your system is fair, then they won't follow the system. So that's a really important part. And I know in our system, we started out with a focus on criminals, so we had to work hard to get the civil bar involved, which is a critical part of any team, and the defense bar. And so, but without them at the table, it does leave a gap in your response team. And so it's really important to work on that, like Sue said. And if you have a team now, or if you're just starting a team, I think one of the best ways to start is to find out what your community needs. Because it's easy for us, I think, sometimes to see what we need and what would work for us, but those needs are not necessarily the same as the community. So it's important to get all the needs, not that our needs aren't important, but it's important to get needs from other people in the community and find out what would work for them. So we, do things like do a mapping of your whole system to find out where people would access the system. How would they access the system? What are their needs at a certain level of how to be involved? What community organizations are out there that might help them? And so make sure you conduct a needs assessment to bring in other members of the community. And then when you bring them in at your meetings, you introduce them to each other, and then you set up this forum for the discussion and education that helps everybody and can help further solidify your process towards making domestic violence an issue in your community that is not so overwhelming. We've also found that if you develop educational systems or some kind of, we call them bench cards, but you can call them palm cards, whatever you want to call them, it's important that you have a directory so that when people leave that particular agency, the next person coming in doesn't have to start from ground zero. So if you develop some sort of a resource card that has the different agencies there, that has different numbers, that talks about what the services are and how people can access them, that's really helpful to make sure that the programs that you feel strongly about continue beyond your involvement with it, because everybody who's a member of these organizations and the courts too, we all move on at some point in our lives to something else. And so it's important to set up these systems that can work for people when they're moving into the systems. And you can do that by developing these cards or educational resource pamphlets that people can use to help access.
And I think you'll be surprised that when you start the mapping, you realize that you make assumptions about how much people understand about what you do. And you may have assumptions about your knowledge about what somebody else does. And when you have these conversations, you realize that, boy, nobody really understood what anybody else does. So that can be a very important foundational element of this. I want to touch just very briefly on the role of the court in a CCR, picking up from our earlier chat box conversation that we were having about whether judges themselves can be involved in CCRs. There's, I think, a public perception that maybe judges ought not to be, because this would somehow violate the appearance of, or create an appearance of impropriety, if you will. And people will say, well, our code of ethics doesn't permit me to do this. And in fact, when you look at your code of ethics and you study what it is you're doing, and you look at what the mission statement of your CCR is, you often find that they dovetail very nicely together, and that in fact you can. So judicial leadership can be incredibly important on these. Whether you feel comfortable chairing or not is sometimes a personal question. I happen to chair my own, but as I was looking through the chat box, it doesn't look like there are many other judges chairing. In the past and in other parts of the country, judges do. But some of this is your own comfort level, and some of it is the purpose behind what your own entity is. But we've sliced out a couple of different judicial ethics opinions on here. One of them is to stress how important it is that you have representatives from all aspects, all components, if you will, of the community. If you do this, if you include the defense bar literally on everything you do, whether it's your CCR, your fatality review team, your protocols, or whatever, you are far more likely to, less likely to have any resistance from anybody about that, because you're hearing from everybody involved. On the other hand, if you are working on a committee that is only focused on looking at or considering the victim standpoint, you can pretty much guarantee that's going to be a problem. On the other hand, issues where we are all working together to improve the administration of justice, that seems to be a very acceptable comfort range for judges to participate in. So look carefully at your code. If you yourself do not feel comfortable participating or leading, consider having one of your clerks or one of your judicial assistants or somebody else participate so that the court has a voice in your CCR.
And I think it's important that the courts do have a voice. And if you can't get the courts in your jurisdiction to be the leaders of it, then it's good to set up a committee, or at least have them come to your meetings, because then they get more involved in it, and then they get to know of the best practices and what the available services are, both for defendants and for victims. It's important that everybody who works on this area, both the civil lawyers, the defense lawyers, the prosecutors, the police, and everybody, all have a common philosophical framework. And that's a great discussion to have, because you'll be surprised when you start working on it, what is the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of the people in your system. And that's just a fun exercise to go through, to try to come up with what your philosophical framework will be for your CCR. And then as we talked about policies in the past, this gives you a chance to establish consistent policies for intervening agencies. And we have found this to be a great thing in terms of efficiency of time and in our court systems and in other areas. For example, we were able to work with our IT department, which is a really important group to have at your community response team. The IT people were great at setting up a coordinated program so that our batterers intervention program could talk to the probation officers, who could talk to the court advocate, or to the court system in terms of presenting documents, and that helps us monitor and track cases to ensure partner accountability. But without IT as part of our group, it wouldn't have gone so smoothly, and it really helped us set up consistent policies so that every provider in town knows they use this system to give this information to probation. And the coordination and exchange of information and the trust that you will see that develops between all the different agencies involved in the work on domestic violence with the bar and the advocates and all aspects of the community is really an important way to make sure we make progress on this issue. You want to make sure that you're looking at what the resources and services are to the members of the community, not only to the victims, but also to defenders, because you need to be able to know where to send defendants in a criminal case if you have accountability issues, or even in a civil case, in an order protection call. We send batterers to batterers intervention programs. So it's important for you to know what those programs are, where they are, how much they cost, and their availability. And because of our work with the batterers program, we were able to get a community program in town to set up one that will provide services at no cost for indigent populations. And that's just as a direct result of our meetings that we had. Now, they do have them do some public service work, and they meet at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. So it's interesting how many people would rather come up with the money for class than be at a class at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. You always want to focus on the protection of children involved in domestic violence cases to make sure that we don't lose sight of those silent witnesses and silent victims. And you constantly have to evaluate what the community what your justice system's response is to make sure that we aren't doing things that aren't victim friendly. You know, for example, if you issue warrants for people who fail to appear at a hearing, and there may be really good reasons for them failure to appear, that might not be the best way to ensure victim safety in your community.
Okay, so we've pretty much touched on that concept, and Rosemary just mentioned again about when entities can meet, but it's important that you have regular meetings, whether you agree that they're going to be weekly or bi-monthly, whatever they are. Create a system of regular convening of these meetings, and then find a place that works for people to be able to get together. We happen to hold ours at the police agency, police department, because they've got a great big conference room and parking. So find a place that works, and then use your CCRs to undertake projects that may be important to your community. And we've touched on a number of these already. I would just caution people to think about, we are now in June, October is coming up fast, so we've got October Domestic Violence Awareness Month. You could be planning an activity now. It does take time to plan these things, so don't lose track of that. But don't forget that there's Teen Dating Violence Month and Stalking Awareness and Sexual Assault. So you can do different events for different points in time. I also want to just make sure that people understand the importance of having a plan of action together, and that you focus very purposefully and intently on bringing in partners who will contribute and getting commitments from people to participate together. Don't just ask somebody to kind of come and go. You need that group dynamic, and you need the commitment of individuals who will come and sustain the lifeblood. There will be turnover, but you need regular, consistent participation. That will help make your CCR all that much more effective and successful. Rosemary?
There are many training and technical assistance projects that are available. I really recommend that you contact the NCJFCJ. They are a great community organization that can help you move forward and to address certain issues. And then, of course, CCI is a great resource. Our training and technical assistance has been really important for us as we have handled a lot of different issues in our community.
And I would say that Rosemary and I have grown up in the council. It has been fundamental to our development as judges, and I can't credit the National Council enough for giving us the skills and the resources to do the work that we do so that we can do our jobs better and serve our communities better. So I also would point out that the National Council is having its annual conference in D.C. this year in July, so you can look on their webpage and also look up CCI for additional information that they can provide. But we both want to thank all of you who've been on this call for an hour. Feels like it's just started a second ago and it's gone so fast. But both of us would be delighted to talk with any of you at a later time offline, and hope that we can see you at some events in the future. So thank you all so much for your attention and your participation today.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.